You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
And Green says, well, show me your papers. Are you legit? Are you a pirate or are you a real Royal Navy officer? And the officer refuses to show his papers. He shoves Green around. He actually punches him. He pushes him into his cabin and he locks the door.
Hello, and welcome to episode 373 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The American Revolution comprised many memorable events. The Stamp Act Riots of 1765, the Tea Crisis of 1773, the coercive or intolerable acts of 1774, the many battles of the War for Independence, and of course, the Declaration of Independence. But the so-called March to Revolution comprised many more events than just the Stamp Act Riots, the Boston Massacre, and the Tea Crisis. One event that we often overlook played an essential and direct role in the events needed to draw the 13 British North American colonies together into a union of coordinated response. An event that played a direct role in the formation of the Intercolonial Committees of Correspondence and the First Continental Congress. That event was the Gaspee Affair of 1772. Adrian Weimer, a professor of history at Providence College, has been researching the Gaspee Affair and what it can tell us about the constitutional balance between the British Empire and its colonies. And she joins us today to lead us on an investigation of the Gaspee Affair. Now, during our exploration, Adrian reveals information about the founding of Rhode Island and how the colony governed itself, British Lieutenant William Duddingston, and what led the Royal Navy to post Duddingston and his ship the Gaspee in Rhode Island waters, and a detailed account of the Gaspee Affair on June 9, 1772. But first, happy holidays! The Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios team and I wish you and your family a very wonderful holiday season. Thank you so much for listening and for spending your time with us this year. We really do love producing new episodes for you, and we look forward to producing more new episodes for you in 2024. All right, are you ready to investigate the Gaspee Affair of 1772? Let's go meet our expert guide. Our guest is a professor of history at Providence College. She's a historian of colonial America and early modern religion and politics. She's written 2 books, Martyr's Mirror, Persecution and Holiness in Early New England, and A Constitutional Culture, New England in the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule in the Restoration Empire. Plus, one of her research projects is about the Gaspee Affair. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Adrian Chastain Weimer.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz. It's great to be here. I always love talking with you about colonial American history. And I'm so grateful to Rhode Island, my adopted home state. I've been here for 12 years. And so I'm excited for the chance to talk about its history a little bit.
I am too. And the American Revolution in Rhode Island is a really interesting topic. And yet, when we think about the Revolution, there is this pantheon of events that we're always talking about. The Boston Massacre, the Battle or Siege of Yorktown. And the Gaspee Affair isn't as famous or as well known as those events, but at the time it took place, it was a really significant event in the Revolution. So, Adrian, would you give us an overview? What was the Gaspee Affair and what happened on June 9, 1772?
Sure. So the Gaspee is a Royal Navy vessel, a British vessel, and it's stationed in Narragansett Bay. And its job, its commission, is to chase smugglers, to crack down on illicit trade. So it's chasing smugglers and it runs aground. It's stranded out there in the Providence River. And late that night, Rhode Islanders row out. They take control of the vessel, they unload the crew, and they torch the ship. And this event sparks a crisis in the relationship between England and the colonies. It is very well known in its own time. It's just as famous as the Boston Massacre.
Okay, now that we know what happened, we should try and understand why Rhode Islanders burned the Gaspee. And I think really in order to do that, we need to know something about the founding of Rhode Island, how the colony was built, its people, and its economy. So, Adrian, would you tell us about the founding of Rhode Island and how it became a colony?
Sure. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, because the Gaspee Affair is really Rhode Islanders sending a signal to officials in England that they think the constitutional balance is off. And so it's really important to know something about where that constitutional balance came from and how it started. So in 1636, Massachusetts leaders banish Roger Williams. He's not actually banished for heresy. He's banished for insulting the king, Charles I, by saying the Church of England is not a true church. The king is the head of the church. If you insult the church, you insult the king. So he's banished because he's a political liability. Letting Roger Williams stay in Massachusetts would have made the colony look seditious, and it would have put their charter, which is a royal charter, at risk. So Roger Williams goes down to Narragansett country. He develops a relationship with Canonicus and other sachems. They very graciously allow him to stay. And the new colony becomes a refuge for people of different religious beliefs, but also for people who don't like government at all. And Rhode Island, from the very beginning, attracts a very eclectic group of radical people. So they tend to not get along. Rhode Island politics is messy then and now. The part of the founding of Providence I think is most important, but doesn't get a lot of attention, is that Williams makes the decision to distribute plots of land equally to every family. And then the heads of the families can all vote. It's an experiment in near direct democracy, which quickly moves in a populist direction. So, Rhode Island is fascinating as a political experiment. It's also, as I said, a really contentious place. They have annual elections. They're hard fought from day one, barely functioning courts, frequent riots. It's a really chaotic place.
When we place Rhode Island within the map of New England, you can see it right there on the Atlantic coast. And you can also see that it's right between Massachusetts and Connecticut, which were both founded as Puritan colonies. Was the religious basis of Rhode Island also that of Puritanism? Was it really steeped in Puritanism, even as you have all these dissenters moving in?
When the New England Confederation is formed in 1643, that's Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Haven, which is its own colony, and Plymouth, which is its own colony. And they deliberately leave out Rhode Island, which is pretty insulting to Rhode Islanders. So in the early years of the colony, Rhode Islanders, like Roger Williams, tend to be seen as outcasts. However, after King Philip's War, which is a devastating war involving Native Americans in 1675 and 1676, that actually shifts. Roger Williams starts to become the spokesperson for all of New England. So there's a lot of Puritans running around in Rhode Island. There's also a lot of religious dissenters, but, they're mostly Baptists and Quakers, both of which are reform movements within Puritanism. So they have a lot in common, even if they have real differences as well.
And what religion did Roger Williams belong to?
So he's 95% Calvinist. He believes most of the same things that John Cotton or Thomas Hooker would have believed, the other famous Puritan ministers. He has different views about the line between church and state, and it's not because he wants Rhode Island to be secular. He doesn't. He still thinks the foundation of law is religion. He still holds a lot of beliefs about the authority of government is rooted in God's authority, but he doesn't want to do things like enforce church attendance on Sundays. And so he does differ on those political polity issues, but in terms of his Calvinism, he holds to that. He does go in a Baptist direction for about a year. And then after that, he worships by himself. He's a utopian. He wants a better, purer version of things, and he's always a bit disappointed.
One of the interesting aspects of Rhode Island's colonial history is its charter. In 1684, the Court of Chancery rewrote the Massachusetts Bay Charter, reorganizing the Bay Colony into a royal colony. There were also colonies like Maryland and Pennsylvania, which were proprietary colonies where the English king awarded men like the Calverts and Penns grants of land in North America so that the colonies formed on those grants would enrich those men and their families. But Rhode Island was founded as a charter colony. Adrian, would you tell us about Rhode Island's existence as a charter colony and how that impacted Rhode Island's politics up into the American Revolution?
It's astonishing. Rhode Island is able to keep its 1663 charter. The other colonies, except for Connecticut, lose their charters. Rhode Island keeps that early charter. So by the time of the American Revolution, it's really a relic of an earlier time. it functions like a monarchical republic. This was the word they used to use. So Rhode Islanders will say, we love the king. We think the king is great. We love being a part of the empire. But on a day-to-day basis, they function with a really high degree of autonomy. I mean, they don't have a royal governor. They have elected representatives who make the laws. They don't have to send their laws to England for approval. And the same elected representatives, the governor, the deputy governor, the assistants, they run the courts. And so there's this sense in which Rhode Island really runs its own show. The fact that they don't have a royal governor also can cause some problems because there's nobody to mediate disputes with England. If one faction in Rhode Island is disappointed, they don't get a royal governor to kind of work out the differences. They appeal straight to the Privy Council, which is the governing body in England. So one scholar has called factionalism in Rhode Island continuous political warfare. And I think that's probably right. There's these factions, there's the Samuel Ward Baptist faction, and there's the Stephen Hopkins Quaker faction. And every single election, it is hard-fought, messy politics. Actually, every single election, both parties' candidates come up with what they call a plan of peace. They say the factionalism is going to end. We're going to figure out a way to work together. And every single year, it fails. The plan of peace doesn't happen. They go right back to scheming the other party's downfall, dredging up dirt on candidates, bribing poor people for their votes. This is continuous political warfare.
So we're really talking about a colony that experienced religious and government strife on a daily basis because of the way that Rhode Island was founded and because of its unique charter, a charter which basically allows Rhode Island to govern itself without a lot of royal input and oversight. And that's something that makes Rhode Island really unique within the British colonies. And one other aspect of Rhode Island's history that I think makes it unique among the colonies is its relationship with the sea. Adrian, would you tell us about Rhode Island's history with the sea and how the sea shaped life in the colony of Rhode Island?
One of the best descriptions of Rhode Islanders' relationship to the sea is actually penned by Rhode Island merchants themselves. It's called the Rhode Island Remonstrance, and it's a document from 1764. It's a protest that they send to the Lords of Trade. And the merchants say, look, Rhode Island has about 48,000 people. It's 30 miles square, and the soil is barren. What are our options, right? We don't have a good export crop. They do actually export cheese and horses and a few other things, flax. But most colonies have some kind of an agricultural base, and Rhode Island really doesn't. They subsist by trade. And mostly by the time of the American Revolution, they subsist in trade in molasses. They sell molasses throughout the Northeast. They buy it from the West Indies, some from the English, a lot from the French, which is technically illegal. So they sell molasses, but they also distill it into rum, which they sell in West Africa in exchange for enslaved people, also elephant tusks. They're part of this broader trade. And the Rhode Island Remonstrance basically says, Britain, you benefit from our trade too. You benefit from all our seafaring voyages as well. Let's find a way for our interests to coincide. One scholar has counted there were at least 30 distilleries in Rhode Island in the time right before the American Revolution. So a huge part of the economy is based on buying molasses, distilling it into rum, and involved in this broader trade. And in the early years of the colonies, that trade is very unregulated. There's very little regulation. And even when England does decide to regulate, there's very little enforcement.
Now that we know a little bit about the history of Rhode Island, let's bring our conversation into the Revolutionary era. So we know that people in Boston were largely revolutionaries. Not everybody in Boston was a revolutionary, but there was a large percentage of revolutionaries in that city. If we go to a place like New York City, the opposite is true. New York City had almost more loyalists per capita than any other place in the colonies. And again, there are exceptions. There are certainly revolutionaries in New York City, but loyalist ideology tends to prevail in that place. And if we go further south and talk about a city like Philadelphia, we'll find that that population there is mainly on the fence about what to do about the revolution. They're in this category we call disaffected. So Adrian, how did the people of Rhode Island feel about the American Revolution? Did they seem to support the revolutionary, loyalist, or disaffected points of view more often than other points of view?
So Rhode Islanders, like most of New England, tend patriot, but there are some Tories. The Tories tend to be Anglicans, so high church people. They tend to be wealthy merchants. A lot of them are in Newport. There's one really interesting Tory leader. His name is Martin Howard. He's an Anglican lawyer. And in 1764, he and his buddies actually petitioned the king. They petitioned George III to yank Rhode Island's charter, to reformulate the government. They say the Rhode Island government is a mess. It's too populist. It's too corrupt. And you can imagine how an ordinary Rhode Islander would feel about this, right? They're outraged. Martin Howard also backs the Stamp Act. He says, sure, the Stamp Act is a good idea. It needs to be regulated. So he writes this very famous document called The Letter from a Gentleman in Halifax. He's not in Halifax, but he just writes it that way. And he says colonists should obey the Stamp Act. The Parliament has a right to tax. And the majority of the population in Rhode Island goes nuts. I mean, they riot about the Stamp Act. So the majority are patriots. I will say there's some people who are patriot all the way up to the time of the American Revolution when they have to take an oath to fight the king, and they can't do it. The governor, Joseph Wanton, fits in that category. He takes the monarchical part of the monarchical republic very seriously, and he just doesn't do it. He doesn't want to take an oath to fight the king, and so he ends up retiring in Newport.
Speaking of the Stamp Act, the 7 Years' War, which took place between 1754 and 1763, cost Great Britain dearly. It more than doubled its national debt, and this was at a time when national debt was not seen as a good thing and something that you should have. Plus, after the war, Great Britain really needed to raise revenue to pay for approximately 10,000 soldiers that it intended to keep in North America, mainly to protect the new territories that it had won from France. And one of the ways that Parliament decided to raise this revenue to keep these soldiers in North America was to start collecting and enforcing customs duties or import taxes. Now, we just talked about how Rhode Island's whole economy was entirely based upon importation and mercantile activities. So please tell us, Adrienne, about Rhode Island's reaction to Parliament's decision to start enforcing and collecting custom duties.
Yeah, there's pretty good evidence that even during the 7 Years' War, Rhode Islanders kept trading with the French. They were trading with the enemy. And actually, there's a whole conversation at the Privy Council about yanking the charter just for that. They did fight for the British. They fought in the 7 Years' War, but it's a colony based on trade. It's very hard to give that up. You know, I went back to the Rhode Island Historical Society and I was looking at the Gaspee collection, which anyone can do. It's a fun thing to do to go over there and look at the manuscripts. And I was reading letters that went back and forth between Providence and London in 1771 and 1772. And I was struck that the laws at stake were the navigation acts that go back to the reigns of Charles II and William III in the 17th century. You know, these issues with trade regulation have been a problem for a very, very long time. According to Parliament, you're supposed to use English manned ships and buy and sell first with England or certain English ports. You're supposed to pay all these import and export duties. And it's a constitutional issue. It's always been a question whether Parliament can legislate for the colonies. And most people say, fine, Parliament, you can pass laws that are good for the empire as a whole, that regulate trade in order to help everyone profit. And so Rhode Islanders, they're willing to pay some taxes. But almost nobody thinks that Parliament can pass laws that are just for revenue, that are just about paying the war debt. Most Rhode Islanders would also feel very strongly that colonial officials, it's people in the colonies who should be the ones enforcing the laws. You know, Rhode Islanders have been smuggling since the 1660s and before, since those very early navigation acts were passed. There's a great scholar, Christian Coote, who has written about smuggling as a political act. It's a way of rejecting policies that seem extractive or capricious. And I think that's right. I think it is a political act to smuggle. I mean, it's about making money, sure, but it's also a political act. After 1696, the British try to enforce the trade laws through admiralty courts. And the problem all along is these are royal courts and they don't have trial by jury. And people feel like that's a violation of their rights that goes back to the Magna Carta. It's one thing if a local person is running the courts, you can negotiate, there's give and take. But if outsiders come in and try to enforce the trade laws, that is a different story.
Smuggling was just a really big part of business in many colonies, not just the British colonies, but in colonies throughout the Americas and the Caribbean as well. It was really just something that people did. So if you're in Parliament and you've decided that one of the ways the government is going to raise the revenue it needs to keep its soldiers in North America is by collecting and enforcing custom and trade duties, how do you go about doing it? How did Parliament seek to disrupt and prevent smugglers from smuggling when they have this really long history of doing it because custom duties are unenforced.
So after the Sugar Act, smuggling skyrockets. And it's not just Rhode Island, not just New England, New York, Pennsylvania, as you were saying. I mean, this is all over the colonies. And it's a way of saying the laws aren't fair, the constitutional balance isn't right. What British officials decide to do is they take a segment of the Royal Navy that was fighting the French, and they turn and send those Royal Navy vessels into the ports of the colonies and charge them with catching smugglers. So 1764, the Admiral of the Royal Navy up in Halifax commissioned 6 new ships to target colonial smugglers. One of them was the Gaspee, another was the St. John.
The Gaspee was under the command of a really interesting figure, Lieutenant William Duddingston. And we'll explore Duddingston and his place in Rhode Island history just after we take a moment to thank our episode sponsor. For nearly a century, Colonial Williamsburg has been a place of inspiration by discovering, curating, and presenting early American history through innovative and compelling programming. In 2026, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation will celebrate the United States' 250th anniversary as well as its own centennial. Through the power of place, the Centennial Campaign for Colonial Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg will expand its mission to reach and inspire people by investing in preservation, education, and civic engagement. They're investing in programming and work like Ben Franklin's World and the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. With your support, Colonial Williamsburg can achieve its mission to inspire people across the country and around the globe. For more information about the power of place, the Centennial Campaign for Colonial Williamsburg, and how you can help support programs and initiatives like Ben Franklin's World and the Innovation Studios, visit benfranklinsworld.com/power of place. That's benfranklinsworld.com/power of place. Adrian, would you tell us about Lieutenant William Duddingston, the commander of the Gaspee, his arrival in Rhode Island, and how his mere presence aggravated Rhode Islanders' ideas about paying custom duties?
The Admiral in Halifax knows he needs the right man for the job. He chose Duddingston because he's tough. There had already been scuffles, run-ins with these Royal Navy vessels in Narragansett Bay. The St. John got into a scuffle with a local population in Newport. They threatened to burn it. They don't, because the St. John turns its guns on the population. Very easily could have sparked the Revolutionary War at that point in 1764. There's another incident that had just happened in 1769 when Rhode Islanders actually did burn a Royal Navy vessel, the ship the Liberty. And so the Admiral in Halifax knows that this is a dangerous post. Duddingston is career Navy. At the time of the Gaspee Affair, he's 33 years old. He is known to be rough. He's known to beat up ships' captains. He knows that Rhode Islanders are probably going to fight back. There's a letter from Rhode Island to Ben Franklin, actually, that says people are scared. People are scared of Duddingston. You know, the Gaspee crew are committing outrages all over the place. They're firing randomly at boats. They're stealing livestock. Duddingston is not afraid to use force, and people are frightened of him.
Would you tell us more about Duddingston's tactics? His job is to go to Rhode Island and cruise its coast to prevent smuggling. But how did Duddingston send the message that, yes, by order of Crown and Parliament, you Rhode Islanders have to stop smuggling and you have to pay your taxes, and I'm here in your waters to ensure that you do both?
There's one Rhode Island captain, a guy named Rufus Green, who testifies later. And he says Duddingston's officer boarded his vessel, accuses him of smuggling. And Green says, well, show me your papers. Are you legit? Are you a pirate or are you a real Royal Navy officer? And the officer refuses to show his papers. He shoves Green around. He actually punches him. He pushes him into his cabin and he locks the door. You know, that gives you a sense of the kind of tactics. I don't think that happened every time. That was probably an egregious case. But we do have multiple reports of the crew of the Gaspee stealing livestock, stealing people's crops, harassing the local population. Rhode Islanders fight back. If Duddingston seizes a boat, which he says has smuggled goods, the colonists might row out at night and seize it right back. This is a very, very tense situation. As you read through these letters between Rhode Island officials and Admiral Montague, who's up in Boston in April and May, things are really heating up. Montague actually hears a rumor that people in Newport are planning to arm a ship and rescue any vessel that the Gaspee captures. We don't know if it's true. It could have been true. It makes sense within the time. And Montague writes back and he says, I'm going to hang them all as pirates. This is a very tense situation. Governor Wanton is furious. He says, no Royal Navy admiral can tell me how to run my colony. He says, I will send my sheriff anytime, any place I think fit. And both sides are appealing to the Secretary of State in England. Things get so bad that when the Gaspee crew just goes on shore to buy things or to have recreation, the Rhode Islanders are so hostile to them. They insult them. They slam them with lawsuits about stolen property. So actually, by April, May of 1772, the Gaspee crew aren't even coming ashore. They're staying on their ship.
Was the Royal Navy legally allowed to do that? Could they just board your ship, say you have smuggled goods because you don't have the receipts you need to show that you paid your taxes, and then confiscate your ship and property? Could they just go on land and impress the livestock of the people of Rhode Island?
Well, I mean, there's a process they were supposed to go through. The problem is the incentive structure, that half of the fee from selling the ship and the goods would go to the officer of the Royal Navy. And so they have an incentive to be very aggressive. It's supposed to go through a process, but I think that process had certainly broken down in Rhode Island.
Well, this sounds like a very tense situation in Rhode Island. You have the British Navy, who, especially under Duddingston, is applying very forceful tactics to stop smuggling and likely to profit a bit too from all those confiscated ships and cargoes. And then you have the Rhode Islanders, who are not taking any of this lightly. They are fighting back. And this is the situation that Rhode Island finds itself in on June 9, 1772. So, Adrienne, please walk us through the events that history includes in the Gaspee Affair so we can understand what happens next.
All right. So the date is June 9th, 1772. Benjamin Lindsay's local guy, sailor, knows the water really well. He happens to be an employee of John Brown, and he sails a little packet ship called the Hannah from Newport to Providence. He doesn't have much cargo, so maybe he was looking for trouble. It's hard to say. Lieutenant Duddingston sees the Hannah and starts to give a chase. They chase up and down Narragansett Bay, up and down the Providence River, and I'm sure that people are watching from the shore. This is the kind of thing that a crowd would have gathered. Lindsay sails the Hannah across a shallow area near Namquit Point, basically near Warwick, Rhode Island. It's probably deliberate. Again, he knows this water very, very well. He knows where the sandbars are. The Gaspee predictably follows him and runs aground. Lindsay goes straight to John Brown and tells him exactly what happened.
And what does John Brown do when he gets the information that the Gaspee has run aground on a sandbar?
So John Brown calls people together at Sabin's Tavern in Providence. It would have been on Main Street. We're pretty sure that he was the instigator. He's a major politician in Providence. He's a trader, slave trader. And we don't know about their conversations. We don't know a lot about what was actually said at Sabin's Tavern. But we do know that around 10 p.m., these people are rowing about 6 miles out to meet the Gaspee. There's at least 8 longboats. There might have been some boats from other places that joined them. And they quietly surround the Gaspee. And I'm pretty sure that the Royal Navy sailors were not expecting this. The Gaspee is stranded all afternoon. And they actually take it as, okay, fine, let's clean the bottom of the ship. They start scraping off barnacles. You know, it's kind of a natural dry dock. They don't seem to be that worried, which is interesting to me. They did try to loosen the ship. They were trying to use the anchor as a lever. They were trying to do all that. But from all accounts, they were not expecting this to happen. So the longboats are surrounding the ship. One of the Gaspee crew sees them and says, "Name yourself. Who are you?" And the Rhode Islanders are just quiet. And so Duddingston wakes up. He comes out himself. And we have accounts later that say it's Abraham Whipple who comes out and says, "I'm the Kent County Sheriff. I have an arrest warrant for you, Duddingston." Now, what happens next? We have conflicting accounts. Duddingston may have shot at the rowboats. If he did, his gun misfired. Rhode Islanders start to climb aboard the Gaspee. Duddingston pulls out his sword. A colonist shoots Duddingston. I mean, it gets around this really fast. We know the bullet grazed Duddingston's arm and it lodged in his groin. There's a full-blown scuffle. The Rhode Islanders take control. They do take time to give medical attention to Duddingston, and they take him and his crew onto the longboats, and then a few go back, and they burn the Gaspee. It burns slowly down to the waterline.
And you mentioned earlier that this isn't the first Royal Navy ship that the people of Rhode Island set fire to.
Yeah, exactly. This had happened multiple times before. Sometimes it was the big ships, sometimes it was the smaller boats. This was a political act. It was a statement to the officials in England, the officials in the Royal Navy, that the constitutional balance was off. They felt their liberties, their constitutional rights were being violated.
So what did the Rhode Islanders do after they took Duddingston and his crew captive and burned the Gaspee?
From what we can tell, they rode the crew to Pawtucket, and Duddingston, it's interesting, they let him recover for a couple of days from his wound, which was not fatal. And then they actually arrest Duddingston for an earlier infringement. Admiral Montague is furious. He just pays Duddingston's bail and sends him back to England. But they let the rest of the crew go free.
Now, at some point after June 9, 1772, I have to believe word of the Gaspee incident makes its way from official reports back to Great Britain. So what was the response there? Did King George III and Parliament have anything to say about the Gaspee Affair?
Yeah, this is a major, major event. It's a huge problem. In fact, the prior year, Parliament had actually passed a law declaring it a felony, an act of treason to burn a royal ship, and said that these crimes were going to be tried in England. Now, they didn't give details on that. That's a big deal for crimes to be tried in England rather than local courts, local juries. George III is going to offer a £5,000 reward for the capture of any of the attackers. And if an accomplice was able to identify one of the leaders, you would get £1,000, extraordinary amount of money. And there's broadsheets printed of the reward. And from one account, they last about 2 hours and then somebody tears them down and tramples them. Admiral Montague in Boston is furious. He basically says, all Rhode Islanders are pirates. All they want to do is defraud the king. This is a major event.
Do we know, or do we have any estimate from the historical records that tells us how many people had £5,000 rewards on their heads because of their participation in the Gaspee burning? Or is this kind of like the Boston Tea Party, where we know it was this clandestine and yet open group event, and we can tell you approximately how many people participated, but we can't really tell you the names of the men who participated in that event?
It's a great question. There are historians who've done some work on this. Stephen Park has done some work on this. We think there were at least 8 boats that left Providence. They probably had 10 men apiece. There were almost certainly other boats who joined them. So somewhere between 80 and 150 men were involved.
Wow. 80 to 150 people doesn't sound like a lot, but in a colony where there's a total population of 48,000,
right,
that actually is a sizable number of people who likely participated in this affair. So how did Rhode Islanders react to the news of the Gaspee Affair and the fact that the king has just put a sizable bounty on many of their fellow Rhode Islanders' heads?
So initially, it's the Rhode Island court that's supposed to investigate. And so the deputy governor does start gathering people, taking evidence, and almost no one is willing to name names. Admiral Montague in Boston is not happy with the investigation as it's happening in Rhode Island. He sees the attack on the Gaspee as an act of treason, so he starts looking for evidence. And about this time, a 16-year-old indentured servant named Aaron Biggs is of African descent, possibly mixed race. He runs away from a Rhode Island household, the household of Samuel Tompkins. And he takes refuge on a British Navy vessel called the Beaver. And the captain of that vessel takes testimony, and Aaron Biggs names names. He starts calling out the men on the longboats, including John Brown and other members of the Brown family. Now, the investigation is still technically under the jurisdiction of Rhode Island, so the captain of the Beaver sends that testimony to Governor Wanton, and Governor Wanton takes it seriously initially. He calls in Samuel Tompkins, the head of household. He calls in the other indentured servants who are also of African or mixed descent. Their names are Somerset and Jack, and they give conflicting testimony. Aaron Biggs said he was on the longboat, so therefore he knew who was involved. And Somerset and Jack say, no, he was with us all night. So the entire case comes down to whether you believe Aaron Biggs. And of course, there are issues of both race and class at work, and the colonists definitely don't believe him. They have political reasons not to. But even the British officials hesitate to proceed on the word of a servant.
Would you help us better understand these issues of race and class that were at play in Aaron Biggs' testimony?
Sure, this is an incredibly hierarchical society. That's true both in the colonies and in England. And, it's difficult to say. Aaron Biggs was caught as a runaway. According to one testimony, he was about to be whipped, and that's when he said, "Oh, I have information that may be valuable to you." On the other hand, there's these other indentured servants who offers testimony. So this is a difficult issue for scholars. How do we handle Aaron Biggs' testimony? How do we handle the testimony of Somerset and Jack? There's incentives on multiple sides. Certainly the fact that Aaron Biggs was of African descent worked against him. Slavery was a major, major part of Rhode Island's economy. There was a clear hierarchy of both race and class. And so the reasons that Aaron Biggs' testimony was disbelieved very much have to do with those hierarchies.
So as Rhode Island investigated the Gaspee Affair, and we did say that the colony took its investigation seriously, but it sounds like Parliament was not really happy with the pace of the way that the colony conducted its investigation. So did Parliament ever launch its own separate investigation into the Gaspee incident?
So the king appoints the Gaspee Commission. It's a Royal Admiralty Commission to investigate. It has 5 members. They're actually all colonial officials. So one's the Rhode Island governor, Joseph Wanton. Then you have a Vice Admiralty court judge, a guy named Robert Ashmuti. You also have the chief justices of New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. So this is an important commission. Now, the fact that the king gives the Gaspee Commission the power to send people to England for trial is a real issue. According to locals, it violates the Magna Carta, your right to a trial by a jury of your peers. And the commission actually says at the beginning, if we seize anybody, we're going to do it through a local court. And they're also supposed to investigate Duddingston and his crew to see if they were overstepping. But most Rhode Islanders don't know that. They don't know the limits of the power of the Royal Commission. And what they do know is that it's authorized to summon the Royal Navy if it's opposed. So it has the power of those warships, many of them are sitting in Boston, at its command.
Did the Gaspee Commission make any arrests? Did they send any Rhode Islanders back to England to be tried?
It does not. They meet in Newport in January of 1773. They summon dozens of people as witnesses. Some people come, some don't. There's actually 3 lawyers from Rhode Island who refuse to appear on principle. They don't think the commission is legal. They don't think it's constitutional. So they say, we're not going to come. They do write a testimony. In the end, the commission decides that there's too many contradictory testimonies and they don't accuse anyone.
And how did people react to the commission's conclusion that there just wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone in the Gaspee Affair? And how was this conclusion received by Parliament and King George III?
Well, it brings up the issue of the Rhode Island Charter again. I mean, if these kind of events, if these kind of crimes, as they see it, aren't prosecuted, is this really a functioning colony? And actually, the New York Chief Justice, a guy named Horsmanden, afterwards, he continues the attack on the Rhode Island Charter. He says this colony is a populous disaster. It should be joined with Connecticut under a royal governor. So I do think the fact that locals aren't willing to name names and give testimony in a way that would have been effective, it does cast doubt on the loyalty of Rhode Island.
How did other colonies react to the news of the commission and to the Gaspee Affair? We know that when big events in the Revolution happen, like the Stamp Act Riots or the Boston Tea Party, word circulates fairly quickly around the different colonies. So how did word circulate about the Gaspee Affair, and how did colonists outside of Rhode Island react to this news?
This is a great question. It's actually the one I'm most interested in and have done the most work on. The first answer is that news circulates very quickly through newspapers, through fast day sermons, Thanksgiving Day sermons, articles in pamphlets about the history of royal commissions. And this is how I got into studying the Gaspee Affair, is that all over the Rhode Island newspapers in 1773, they're reporting on this event that happened back in 1665, which was another time a royal commission was empowered by the king to investigate New England. And it's a very exciting story, but basically the long and short of it is that most New Englanders defy the royal commissioners. They say, you are not constitutional. You do not have rights to overturn the jurisdiction of our courts. and they kicked the Royal Commission out. So all over the newspapers in 1773 are actually documents, reprinted documents, primary sources from that event in 1665 and all the constitutional arguments that people had used to kick out that earlier Royal Commission. So the role of the press and the clergy at this time was to remind people of historical precedent. Newspapers see as part of their job to make sure people know about their own history in ways that are going to inform their constitutional sensibilities. The news also circulates very quickly because of a sermon given by this one guy, John Allen, who's an itinerant Baptist preacher. And this sermon in its own time is going to be as famous as Common Sense, as Thomas Paine's pamphlet. It's called An Oration on the Beauties of Liberty, or the Essential Rights of the Americans. And Thomas Paine, of course, gets all the press. But at the time, this sermon, it's about the Gaspee Affair. It is just as important. And he basically combines John Calvin and John Locke to argue that kingship is not sacred, that people have a right to resist a king who's a tyrant. He says the creation of the Gaspee Commission with unconstitutional powers is an attempt to destroy the rights of the people, and it destroys the king's right to reign. So this pamphlet is reprinted across the colonies, multiple editions. It becomes a sensational piece of press, and it's more than anything what gets the word out about the Gaspee Affair.
After the Boston Tea Party, a lot of the colonies responded with aid for Boston. They had a genuine sympathy because they really felt that the colonists of Boston and Massachusetts in general were under siege from the British Empire. Did the Gaspee Affair, the investigation of it by the Royal Commission, and the threats of removing Rhode Island's charter generate any similar sympathy from other colonies?
I'm not sure there was material support, but in the newspapers of 1772, 73, 74, you do see a lot of compassion and sympathy for Rhode Islanders, for what they've gone through with the British Royal Navy, for the kind of harassment. Because the British Royal Navy was so aggressive in Narragansett Bay, ordinary shipments of food, of wood, of household supplies had really slowed down, and so the prices had shot up. So ordinary people were having a hard time making ends meet. It really was a difficult situation. And, there's also the issue of impressment. Royal Navy officers would try to impress whole boatloads of Rhode Island sailors. And Rhode Islanders would fight back, but some of them did get impressed into service in the British Royal Navy. And that wasn't just happening in Rhode Island. It was happening in lots of places. But I do think there was sympathy for their situation.
And what about the legacies of the Gaspee Affair? In his autobiography, Thomas Jefferson wrote about the Gaspee and stated, quote, "A court of inquiry held at Rhode Island in 1772 with a power to send persons to England to be tried for offenses committed here in the colonies was considered at our session of the Virginia House of Burgesses in the spring of 1773 as demanding attention," end quote. So what did the Gaspee Affair mean for the other colonies? Why was it an event that the Virginia House of Burgesses felt worth talking about within the context of their own colony?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Virginia leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, they are alarmed by the powers given to this Admiralty Commission, the Gaspee Commission. And this really does spark the decision to start creating committees of correspondence, which, Virginia does it, but a lot of other colonies follow. And they basically say, hey, if this kind of thing is going to happen, if they're going to treat us this way, give these commission, like the Gaspee Commission, powers to send people back to England for trial, to negate our right of trial by jury in a local court according to local law. This is not a small thing. This is something we should all care about. And so the Committee of Correspondence are really about sharing information about just this kind of event, just this kind of overreach among the various colonies.
I think one conclusion we could draw from today's conversation is that the Gaspee Affair was a much bigger event than our history books typically give it credit for being. And as you just said, the Gaspee Affair really provided a sizable excuse for Virginia to propose the intercolonial committees of correspondence that would ultimately lead to the First and Second Continental Congresses. So we're talking about an event that actually helped form what we'll know as the United States Union as time goes on. But if it's such an important event, why doesn't it rank higher in the pantheon of events of the American Revolution?
The Gaspee Affair was well known in the 19th century. It was well known in the early 20th century. I think it's only more recently, actually, that we've lost it. There's lots of ways that people kept these stories alive. There's actually a really popular drinking ballad that was written in 1772 by a Bristol guy. Do you want to hear a little bit of the drinking ballad? It's about the bullet to Duddingston's groin. Do you still want to hear it?
After all that buildup, I think we need to hear it.
What was best of all their tricks, they in his breech a ball did fix. Then set the men upon the land and burnt her up, we understand. Which thing provokes the king so high, he said those men shall surely die.
I can almost hear the drinking tune being sung in the tavern to these lyrics. But more seriously, how do Rhode Islanders commemorate the Gaspee today?
In the mid-19th century, I love this. It's a great historical irony. Rhode Islanders named one of their fire engines the Gaspee number 9. I love it. And, since 1965, Rhode Islanders have organized what they call Gaspee Day, which is a parade, a 5K race. They reenact the burning of the ship. A local brewery last year made the Centennial Ale in honor of the 250th anniversary of the Gaspee Affair. So Rhode Islanders do celebrate their history, but I think it deserves even broader attention.
So what do you think we can do to get the event broader attention?
Well, I think your podcast is wonderful. But yeah, I think this is a larger issue. It's an issue I care a lot about. How do we nurture constitutional sensibilities in any given time and place? How do we make sure that people know when their rights are violated, that they have a literacy about issues of legal constitutional liberty?
Well, with that, we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the Gaspee Affair had never taken place? How do you think this series of events needed to turn the American Revolution from a political and economic movement into a war for independence would have been different? Do you think the colonies still would have declared their independence if the Gaspee Affair had never taken place?
Well, the Gaspee Affair, and especially John Allen's Oration on the Beauty of Liberty, it catches the imagination of people, not just in New England, but in Pennsylvania and Virginia. So if it hadn't happened, I think cross-colonial unity might have taken a lot longer. The strategy of the British, whether it's in 1665 or 1775, is to isolate New England. That's their strategy. They call New Englanders fanatics, seditious Puritans, regicides, right? Descendants of those people who killed Charles I at the end of the English Civil War. So the Gaspee Affair, I think, helps to prevent that isolation from happening. It thwarts that goal of the British, which is to isolate New England. And it's very important in helping colonists forge a bond across colonies and begin to cooperate.
Well, we gathered here today to talk about the Gaspee Affair, but Adrian, you have a new book out. It's called A Constitutional Culture, New England and the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule and the Restoration Empire. Would you tell us about your new book and where we can find a copy?
So my book is about those events in the 1660s, those same ones that Rhode Islanders immediately think of when the king creates the Gaspee Commission. It's about this time when men and women in small towns all across New England mobilized to defy royal commissioners. So it's a story about spies and petition campaigns and a concentrated effort to hide political fugitives. And it's really about these broader questions of how did people nurture constitutional sensibilities? How did people know their rights? How did people get information about politics? How did they get reliable information? How did they know when their liberties had been violated? And it's a story that involves Native Americans. There's Shawmut Sachem Pomham gets very involved in these debates. It involves Quakers and women who get involved in these debates. An astonishing number of people in rural communities across New England get involved in defying the king. They say there's a line you cannot cross. So it's about grassroots political mobilizing in the 1660s when Charles II tries to redesign the New England colonies.
So it sounds like a great book that would help us further contextualize the Gaspee Affair. And speaking of the Gaspee, do you have any resources you could recommend so we can further our knowledge about the Gaspee incident?
There's some terrific resources out there I would highly recommend. There's a virtual reality exhibit that a colleague at Brown has done. If you Google virtual reality Gaspee, it's really nicely done. A group of students worked on it. I would also recommend Stephen Park's book on the burning of the Gaspee. He does a really nice job getting into the evidence. There's other wonderful scholarly resources. So I hope people will pursue the topic further.
And where's the best place to reach you if we have more questions?
So you can Google Weimer and Providence College. My website will show up. It has an email on it, and feel free to be in touch.
Adrienne Weimer, thank you for taking us through the Gaspee Affair and for updating our knowledge about the American Revolution.
Thanks for having me.
The Gaspee Affair was an important event in the history of the American Revolution. Now, although our collective memory has largely forgotten the events of June 9, 1772, the burning of the Royal Naval vessel Gaspee had profound implications for the progression of the Revolution, helping it move from a political and economic movement to a fight for independence. As Adrienne noted, the Gaspee Affair didn't just alarm the people of Rhode Island and New England. It made other colonial governments, like the one in Virginia, think about what it would mean for their rights as British citizens if the imperial government could try colonists accused of certain crimes in England rather than in the colonies. It also made them think about the extending and expanding reach of imperial governance in their lives. It was thanks to the Gaspee Affair in Rhode Island that the Virginia House of Burgesses called upon all the North American colonies to form the Intercolonial Committees of Correspondence, committees that the colonies used to share news and information that helped them stay abreast of the expanding boundaries of British power, and that also helped them better coordinate responses to those expanding boundaries. Now, it's also interesting to think about Adrienne's frame for the Gaspee Affair. As a scholar of political and religious history, Adrienne encouraged us to view the burning of the Gaspee as a message and perhaps a warning from Rhode Islanders to the British imperial government that their constitutional balance was off. Now, the term constitutional balance is a way to describe the balance between the power exercised by local colonial governments like the Rhode Island Charter Government and the power exercised by the imperial British government by Crown and Parliament in London. After the 7 Years' War, the British Empire expanded to include colonies all over the world. With more territories to monitor, govern, and defend, Great Britain realized that it couldn't continue to govern its empire as it had been if it was going to keep hold of all of its colonies and its wartime gains. So as the British government experimented to figure out what would work to administer such a far-flung empire, colonists in long-existing colonies like Rhode Island felt the change in imperial governance practices acutely. So I don't know about you, but I'm picturing a two-sided scale that started out roughly in balance and then seesaws back and forth as different events or weights of the revolution are applied by either side. So the Gaspee we can think of as one of those weights on the colonies side, and Great Britain's response to the Gaspee with that commission comprises a different weight on Great Britain's side. Anyway, that's just something interesting to consider and to picture in our minds as we think about the American Revolution. You'll find more information about Adrienne, her book, A Constitutional Culture, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/373. And please check out the show notes page, as we have linked to the other sources that Adrienne mentioned, as well as to a timeline that we created here at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios that will help you see where the Gaspee Affair fits within the timeline of events of the American Revolution. Now, if you enjoyed what you heard, please tell your friends. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed Ben Franklin's World today, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Joseph Edelman, Katie Schinnebeck, Ashley Bachnight-Claybrooks, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what is your historical memory of the American Revolution? Did it already include the Gaspee Affair? Does it include a different event or events that people rarely talk about, but you really think are very important to the revolution? I'd love to know. So tell me, Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.